We are back, page 560, chapter 18, the Progressive Era. We left off at the end of labor and civil liberties, and now we're about to discuss, or read, the new feminism. During the Progressive Era, the word feminism first entered the political vocabulary. In 1914, a mass meeting at New York's Cooper Union debated the question, what is feminism? Feminism, said one speaker, meant woman's emancipation, both as a human being and as a sex being. New feminism's forthright attack on traditional rules of sexual behavior added a new dimension to the idea of personal freedom. One symbol of the new era was Isidora Duncan, who brought from California a new expressive dance based on the free movement of a body liberated from the constraints of a traditional technique and costume. I beheld the dance I had always dreamed of, wrote the novelist Edith Wharton on seeing a Duncan performance, satisfying every sense as a flower does, or a phrase of Mozart's. During this era, as journalist William M. Reedy jested, it struck 6 o'clock in America. Issues of intimate personal relations previously confined to private discussion blazed forth in popular magazines and public debates. For the generation of women who adopted the word feminism to express their demand for greater liberty, free sexual expression, and reproductive choice emerged as critical definitions of women's emancipation. The birth control movement. The growing presence of women in the labor market reinforced demands for access to birth control, an issue that gave political expression to changing sexual behavior. Emma Goldman, who had emigrated to the United States from Lithuania at the age of 16, toured the country lecturing on subjects from anarchism to the need for more enlightened attitudes toward homosexuality. She regularly included the right to birth control in her speeches and distributed pamphlets that detailed information about various contraceptive devices. By forthrightly challenging the laws banning contraceptive information and devices, Margaret Sanger, one of the 11 children of an Irish and American working-class family, placed the birth control movement at the heart of the new feminism. In 1911, she began a column on sex education, What Every Girl Should Know, for The Call, a New York socialist newspaper. Postal officials barred one issue containing a column on venereal diseases from the mails. The next issue of The Call included a blank page with the headline, What Every Girl Should Know, Nothing, by order of the U.S. Post Office. By 1914, the intrepid Sanger was openly advertising birth control devices in her own journal, The Woman Rebel. No woman can call herself free, she proclaimed, who does not own and control her own body and can choose consciously whether she will or will not be a mother. In 1916, Sanger opened a clinic in a working-class neighborhood of Brooklyn and began distributing contraceptive devices to poor Jewish and Italian women, an action for which she was sentenced a month in prison. Native American Progressivism. Many groups participated in Progressive Impulse. Founded in 1911, the Society of American Indians was a reform organization typical of the era. It brought together Indian intellectuals to promote discussion of the plight of Native Americans in the hope that public exposure would be the first step toward remedying injustice. It created a pan-Indian public space independent of white control. Many of these Indian intellectuals were not unsympathetic to the basic goals of federal Indian policy, including the transformation of communal landholdings on reservations into family farms. But Carlos Montezuma, a founder of the Society of American Indians, became an outspoken critic. Born in Arizona, he had been captured as a child by members of a neighboring tribe and sold to a traveling photographer, who brought him to Chicago. There, Montezuma attended school and eventually obtained a medical degree. In 1916, Montezuma established a newsletter, Wasaja, meaning signaling, that called for the abolition of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Convinced that the outsiders exerted too much power over life on the reservations, he insisted that self-determination was the only way for Indians to escape poverty and marginalization. But he also demanded that Indians be granted full citizenship and all the constitutional rights of other Americans. Indian activists would later rediscover him as a forerunner of Indian radicalism. The politics of progressivism. Effective freedom. Progressivism was an international movement. In the early 20th century, cities throughout the world experienced similar social strains arising from rapid industrialization and urban growth. Reformers across the globe exchanged ideas and envisioned new social policies. The Chinese leader Sun Yat-sen, for example, was influenced by the writings of Henry George and Edward Bellamy. As governments in Britain, France, and Germany instituted old age pensions, minimum wage laws, unemployment insurance, and the regulation of workplace safety, American reformers came to believe they had much to learn from the Old World. The term social legislation, meaning governmental action to address urban problems and the insecurities of working-class life, originated in Germany, but soon entered the political vocabulary of the United States. Drawing on the reform programs of the Gilded Age and the example of European legislation, progressives sought to reinvigorate the idea of an activist, socially conscious government. Progressives could reject the traditional assumption that powerful government posed a threat to freedom because their understanding of freedom was itself in flux. Effective freedom, wrote the philosopher John Dewey, was a positive, not a negative concept, the power to do specific things. It sometimes required the government to act on behalf of those with little wealth or power. Thus, freedom in the progressive era inevitably became a political question. State and local reforms. In the United States, with a political structure more decentralized than in European countries, state and local governments enacted most of the era's reform measures. In cities, progressives worked to reform the structure of government to reduce the power of political bosses, establish public control of natural monopolies like gas and waterworks, and improve public transportation. They raised property taxes in order to spend more money on schools, parks, and other public facilities. Gilded Age mayors and governors pioneered urban progressivism. A former factory worker who became a successful shoe manufacturer, Hazen Pingree, served as the mayor of Detroit from 1889 to 1897. He battled the business interests that had dominated city government, forcing gas and telephone companies to lower their rates, and established a municipal power plant. Progressivism in the West. Although often associated with eastern cities, progressivism was also a major presence in the West. Former populists and those who believed in the moral power of the frontier gravitated to progressive programs to regulate the railroads and other large corporations, and to the idea that direct democracy could revitalize corrupt politics. Important progressive leaders worked for reform in western states and municipalities, including Hiram Johnson of California and Robert Laffollette of Wisconsin. Oregon stood at the forefront of progressive reform. The leading figure in that state was William Wren, a lawyer who entered politics as a supporter of Henry George's single tax program. Wren was the founder of the Oregon system, which included the initiative and referendum, also known as direct legislature, which enabled voters to propose and vote on laws. Direct primaries to choose candidates for office as an effort to weaken the power of political bosses, and the recall, by which officials could be removed from office by popular vote. Using the initiative, progressives won the vote for women in the state. The Oregon system, studied and emulated in many other states, came into being via an alliance of the urban middle class with reform-minded farmers and workers. But fault lines appeared when labor-oriented progressives tried to use the initiative and referendum to increase taxes on the well-to-do and required the state to provide jobs for the unemployed. Both measures failed. Moreover, the initiative system quickly became out of control. In the 1912 election, voters in Portland were asked to evaluate 40 measures seeking to become law. Nonetheless, between 1910 and 1912, Oregon's West Coast neighbors, Washington and California, also adopted the initiative and referendum and approved women's suffrage. In California, where a Republican machine closely tied to the Southern Pacific Railroad had dominated politics for decades, progressives took power under Governor Hiram Johnson, who held the office from 1911 to 1917. As public prosecutor, Johnson had secured the conviction for bribery of a San Francisco political boss, having promised to kick the Southern Pacific Railroad out of politics. He secured passage of the Public Utilities Act, one of the country's strongest railroad regulation measures, as well as laws banning child labor and limiting the work hours of women. The most influential progressive administration at the state level was that of Robert M Lawfuletta, who made Wisconsin a laboratory for democracy. After serving as a Republican member of Congress, Lawfuletta became convinced that an alliance of railroad and lumber companies controlled state politics. Elected governor in 1900, he instituted a series of measures known as the Wisconsin Idea, including nominations of candidates from office through primary elections rather than by political bosses, the taxation of corporate wealth, and state regulation of railroads and public utilities. Let me read that again. Elected governor in 1900, he instituted a series of measures known as the Wisconsin Idea, including nominations of candidates for office through primary elections rather than by political bosses, the taxation of corporate wealth, and state regulations of railroads and public utilities. Other measures created a statewide system of insurance against illness, death, and accident, barred the sale to private companies of land, mineral rights, and other natural resources owned by the state, required safety devices on various forms of machinery, and prohibited child labor. To staff his administration, he drew on nonpartisan faculty members from the University of Wisconsin. Wisconsin offered the most striking merger of the social and political impulses that went under the name of Progressivism. Progressive democracy. Progressives hope to reinvigorate democracy by restoring political power to the citizenry and civic harmony to a divided society. Alarmed by the upsurge in violent class conflict and the unrestricted power of corporations, they believe that political reforms could help to create a unified people devoted to greater democracy and social reconciliation. Yet increasing the responsibilities of government made it all the more important to identify who was entitled to political participation and who was not. The Progressive era saw a host of changes implemented in the political process, many seemingly contradictory in purpose. The electorate was simultaneously expanded and contracted, empowered and removed from direct influence on many functions of government. Democracy was enhanced by the 17th Amendment, which provided that U.S. senators be chosen by popular vote rather than by state legislators, by widespread adoption of the popular election of judges, and by the use of primary elections among party members to select candidates for office. The era culminated with the constitutional amendment enfranchising women, the largest expansion of democracy in American history. But the Progressive era also witnessed numerous restrictions on democratic participation, most strikingly the disenfranchisement of blacks in the South, as noted in Chapter 17. To make city government more honest and efficient, many localities replaced elected mayors with appointed nonpartisan commissions or city managers, a change that insulated officials from machine domination but also from popular control. New literacy tests and residency and registration requirements, common in northern as well as southern states, limited the right to vote among the poor. In the eyes of many progressives, the fitness of voters, not their absolute numbers, defined a functioning democracy. Most progressive thinkers were highly uncomfortable with the real world of politics, which seemed to revolve around the pursuit of narrow of a narrow class ethnic and regional interest. Robert M. Lawfulette's reliance on college professors to staff important posts in his administration reflected a larger progressive faith and expertise. The government could best exercise intelligent control over society through democracy run by impartial experts who were in many respects unaccountable to the citizenry. Political freedom was less a matter of direct participation in government than of qualified persons devising the best public policies. Jane Addams and a Whole House. But alongside this elitist politics, progressivism also included a more democratic vision of the activist state. As much as any other group, organized women reformers spoke for the more democratic side of progressivism. Still barred from voting and holding office in most states, women nonetheless became central to the political history of the progressive era. The immediate catalyst was a growing awareness among women reformers of the plight of poor immigrant communities in the emergence of the condition of women and child laborers as a major focus of public concern. The era's most prominent female reformer was Jane Addams, who had been born in 1860, the daughter of an Illinois businessman. In 1889, she founded the Whole House in Chicago, a settlement house devoted to improving the lives of the immigrant poor. Unlike previous reformers who had aided the poor from afar, settlement house workers moved into poor neighborhoods. They built kindergartens and playgrounds for children, established employment bureaus and health clinics, and showed female victims of domestic abuse how to gain legal protection. By 1910, more than 400 settlement houses had been established in cities throughout the country. Addams was typical of the progressive era's new woman. By 1900, there were more than 80,000 college-educated women in the United States. Many found a calling in providing social services, nursing, and education to poor families in the growing cities. The efforts of middle-class women to uplift the poor and of laboring women to uplift themselves helped to shift the center of gravity of politics toward activist government. Women like Addams discovered that even well-organized social work was not enough to alleviate the problems of inadequate housing, income, and health. Government action was essential. Whole House instigated an array of reforms in Chicago, soon adopted elsewhere, including stronger building and sanitation codes, shorter working hours and safe labor conditions, and the right of labor to organize. The settlement houses have been spearheads for reform. Florence Kelley, a veteran of Whole House, went on to have been called spearheads of reform. Florence Kelley, a veteran of Whole House, went on to mobilize women's power as consumers as a force for social change. Under Kelley's leadership, the National Consumers League became the nation's leading advocate of laws governing the working conditions of women and children. The Campaign for Women's Suffrage. After 1900, the campaign for women's suffrage moved beyond the elitism of the 1890s to engage a broad coalition ranging from middle-class members of women's clubs to unionists, socialists, and settlement house workers. For the first time, it became a mass movement. Membership in the National American Women's Suffrage Association grew from 13,000 in 1893 to more than 2 million by 1917. By 1900, more than half the states allowed women to vote in local elections dealing with school issues and By 1900, more than half the states allowed women to vote in local elections dealing with school issues, and Wyoming, Colorado, Idaho, and Utah had adopted full women's suffrage. Between 1910 and 1914, 7 more western states enfranchised women. In 1913, Illinois became the first state east of the Mississippi River to allow women to vote in presidential elections. These campaigns, which brought women aggressively into the public sphere, were conducted with a new spirit of militancy. They also made effective use of techniques of advertising, publicity, and mass entertainment characteristic of modern consumer society. California's successful 1911 campaign utilized automobile parades, numerous billboards and electric signs, and countless suffrage buttons and badges. Nonetheless, state campaigns were difficult, expensive, and usually unsuccessful. The movement increasingly focused its attention on securing a national constitutional amendment giving women the right to vote. Maternalist Reform. Ironically, the desire to exalt women's role within the home did much to inspire the reinvigoration of the suffrage movement. Female reformers helped to launch a mass movement for direct government action to improve the living standards of poor mothers and children. Laws providing for mothers' pensions, state aid to mothers of young children who lacked male support, spread rapidly after 1910. These maternalist reforms rested on the assumption that the government should encourage women's capacity for bearing and raising children and enable them to be economically independent at the same time. Both feminists and believers in conventional domestic roles supported such measures. The former hoped that these laws would subvert women's dependence on men, the latter that they would strengthen traditional families and mother-child bond. Other progressive legislation recognized that large numbers of women did in fact work outside the home, but defined them as a dependent group, like children, in need of state protection in ways male workers were not. In 1908, in the landmark case of Moeller v. Oregon, Louis D. Brandeis filed a brief citing scientific and sociological studies to demonstrate that because they had less strength and endurance than men, long hours of labor were dangerous for women, while their unique ability to bear children gave the government a legitimate interest in their working conditions. Persuaded by Brandeis's argument, the Supreme Court unanimously upheld the constitutionality of an Oregon law settling maximum working hours for women. Thus, 3 years after the notorious Lochner decision, invalidating a New York law limiting the working hours of male bakers discussed in Chapter 16, the court created the first large breach in liberty of contract doctrine. But the cost was high. At the very time that women in unprecedented numbers were entering the labor market and earning college degrees, Brandeis's brief in the court's opinion solidified the view of women's workers as weak, dependent, and incapable of enjoying the same economic rights as men. By 1917, 30 states had enacted laws limiting the hours of labor of female workers. The maternalist agenda that built gender inequality into the early foundations of the welfare state by extension raised the idea that government should better the living and working conditions of men as well. Indeed, Brandeis envisioned the welfare state as one rooted in the notion of universal economic entitlements, including the right to a decent income and protection against unemployment and work-related accidents. This vision, too, enjoyed considerable support in the progressive era. By 1913, 22 states had enacted workmen's compensation laws to benefit workers, male or female, injured on the job. This legislation was the first wedge that opened the way for broader programs of social insurance. But state minimum wage laws and most laws regulating working hours applied only to women. Women and children may have needed protection, but interference with the freedom of contract of adult male workers was still widely seen as degrading. The establishment of a standard of living and working conditions beneath which no American male or female should be allowed to fall would await the coming of the New Deal. I'm going to take a quick break.